Have you ever watched an arrogant fool dig his own grave and carefully hand you the shovel I have? Do not scroll past because this is not a standard firing, but a chess match worth millions of dollars. If you crave seeing nepotism hires destroyed by their own greed, pour yourself some coffee. The final twist is so ruthlessly perfect, it will keep you smiling for an entire work week. Welcome to the art of office survival. Hello and welcome back to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, where we appreciate your continued support more than words can say. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating normally. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon, where you will find even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story with our protagonist, Morgan Wallace. I was 34 years old and serving as the lead of data architecture at AuraGrid Analytics, a rapidly expanding data brokerage and analytics firm based in Austin, Texas. The city was a glittering hub of tech money and superficial innovation, and AuraGrid fit right in. While the sales teams and the executive board spent their days popping expensive champagne over revenue milestones and patting themselves on the back, I was the quiet, practical force operating strictly behind the scenes. I built the invisible, relentless core systems that actually generated those massive profits. I did not care about office politics, mandatory team-building retreats, or corporate popularity contests. My world was logical. I cared about clean code, flawless execution, and building digital architecture that ran without a single failure. Then came Julian. Julian was the nephew of our chief executive officer, Sterling Vance. If you have ever worked in the modern tech industry, you already know a Julian. He was the ultimate fake tech bro, a man who treated his daily podcast listening habits as a substitute for an actual personality. He had failed upward his entire life. He constantly spouted meaningless, inspirational quotes about hustle culture while strutting around the office wearing custom-tailored blazers over overpriced designer t-shirts. Despite possessing absolutely zero knowledge of coding, data structuring, or even basic software engineering, Julian had just been magically appointed as the Vice President of Strategic Innovation. His entire job seemed to consist of walking around the engineering floor, disrupting actual work, and using buzzwords like synergy, disruptive scaling, and paradigm shift, while contributing absolutely nothing of value to the organization. It did not take long for Julian to set his greedy sights on Project Nighthawk. Nighthawk was my undisputed masterpiece. It was a superior artificial intelligence data optimization algorithm that I had spent 2 grueling years developing from the ground up. It was designed to process, filter, and optimize massive data sets at a speed that AuraGrid had never seen before. It had the potential to cut operational costs by roughly 70% and drive revenue through the roof. It was the undeniable future of the company, and Julian knew it. He also knew that if he could somehow steal the credit and attach his name to my work, he would instantly secure a massive victory with the board of directors and permanently solidify his unearned executive position. The trap was officially set on a Friday afternoon. I received a sudden calendar invite for a mandatory sync in one of the heavily frosted glass conference rooms at the end of the hall. When I walked in, the air conditioning was blowing cold, and Julian was already sitting at the head of the large polished oak table. Next to him rested a cheap, flat-packed cardboard box. He wore a condescending, highly practiced smile that immediately told me everything I needed to know about my future at the company. "Morgan, please take a seat," Julian said, steepling his fingers in a pose he undoubtedly copied from a weekend management seminar. "We are restructuring our entire engineering department to better reflect a lean, agile workflow. Unfortunately, your current role no longer aligns with the lean vision of this company moving forward." He slid a thick stack of freshly printed papers across the polished table. It was a standard severance package, but attached to it was a non-disclosure agreement so incredibly harsh and legally suffocating that it almost looked like a parody of corporate greed. Julian leaned forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy and barely contained arrogance. "This agreement ensures a smooth and professional transition for both parties," Julian explained, tapping the heavy paper with his ridiculously expensive fountain pen. "It explicitly strips you of any and all intellectual property rights regarding Project Nighthawk. It legally binds you to absolute silence. You are permanently banned from ever mentioning the algorithm, claiming any credit for it, or discussing your involvement with it to anyone in the industry. The company officially owns everything you leave behind in this room." He sat back and waited. He waited for the tears. He waited for the anger, the outrage, or the desperate pleading that men like him fed on to feel powerful and validated. He got absolutely none of that from me. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply picked up the heavy document and scanned the pages carefully. My eyes locked onto one tiny, specific clause buried deep within the dense legal jargon. It was a suffocating, blanket statement clearly added by Julian himself to flex his newfound executive authority. It stated in plain text that Oragrid assumed total ownership, responsibility, and liability for all intellectual property abandoned on company premises. An imperceptible smirk briefly touched the corners of my mouth. I looked up at Julian, picked up the pen, and calmly signed my name on the dotted line. I stood up, took the cheap cardboard box, and walked out of the frosted glass door, leaving him grinning with the triumphant satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he had just won the war. It took me precisely 5 minutes to dismantle my entire existence at the office. The open floor plan was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the massive cooling units operating in the server room down the hall. I unplugged my custom-built mechanical keyboard, wrapping the heavy braided cable into a perfect, tight coil. The cold metal chassis felt wonderfully familiar against my palms. Next, I picked up the small, spiky green cactus that had faithfully guarded the corner of my desk for the past 3 years. That was the entirety of my harvest. That was absolutely everything I claimed as my own. I deliberately abandoned the sleek, company-issued laptops exactly where they sat. More importantly, I left 3 heavy silver external solid-state drives and 2 incredibly thick black binders containing the foundational architecture maps of the algorithm stacked neatly right in the dead center of the desk. They sat there in the quiet office like a beautifully wrapped present left under a tree for a dangerously greedy child. By the time my car tires hit the sweltering pavement of the employee parking garage, the notifications on my mobile phone were already vibrating wildly against the passenger seat. A loyal former colleague was frantically texting me live updates from an emergency, company-wide virtual meeting. I did not even need to log into the call to picture the pathetic scene perfectly. Julian was aggressively holding court. According to the transcript my colleague sent, Julian was staring directly into his high-definition web camera, using his heavily practiced podcast voice to casually assassinate my professional reputation. He called my sudden departure a necessary shedding of corporate dead weight, repeatedly referring to me as the stagnant inertia of an older generation, without missing a beat. He smoothly pivoted his false narrative, proudly declaring himself the new visionary architect who would be taking direct, hands-on control of the algorithm. I drove back to my downtown apartment while the harsh Texas heat shimmered violently off the gray asphalt. Inside, the central air conditioning provided a sharp, biting relief that immediately cleared my head. I did not turn on my computer to frantically update my professional networking profiles. I did not shed a single tear of frustration, nor did I harbor an ounce of sorrow. Instead, I walked straight to my marble kitchen island, selected a heavy glass bottle of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, and pulled the cork with a deeply satisfying, hollow pop. I poured a generous glass, watching the dark crimson liquid coat the curved sides of the crystal. The silence in my apartment was not the depressing silence of defeat. It was the breathless, calculated quiet of a seasoned hunter waiting patiently in a hidden blind. I picked up my phone and dialed a highly secured number I had memorized precisely 6 months ago. "Morgan?" The deep voice on the other end answered on the second ring. It was Elias. He was a high-profile intellectual property attorney whose brutal reputation in elite legal circles was utterly terrifying. Elias did not negotiate settlements. He annihilated opposing corporate counsel. He was the kind of lawyer who wore immaculate, pitch-dark suits and spoke with a chilling, clinical precision that could instantly freeze the blood of the most arrogant corporate executives. "The package is signed. Elias," I said softly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the dark wine. He swallowed the bait entirely. He officially claimed total ownership of everything I left on that desk. I could practically hear the predatory, shark-like grin spreading across his face through the receiver. "Perfect. The board of directors is completely blind to what they just legally authorized." Here is the fundamental truth about unchecked corporate arrogance. It breeds staggering, almost comical laziness. Julian assumed that simply because I occupied a chair in his building, everything my brain produced belonged exclusively to his family empire. He was profoundly, legally wrong. I had never written a single line of the core optimization logic on any network, server, or device owned by Oragrid. I had engineered the absolute foundation of that revolutionary software over hundreds of exhausting weekends, sitting right here in my quiet living room, typing furiously on my own personal, heavily encrypted workstation. I had legally registered every single proprietary line of that source code under an entirely separate limited liability company that I owned entirely by myself. The harsh reality was that Oragrid did not own the software. They never had. They were merely renting it on a temporary basis. 3 years prior, the former chief executive officer, a brilliant man who actually understood complex technology and recognized my immense leverage, had quietly signed an anonymous software licensing agreement directly with my private shell corporation. It was a brilliant, ironclad legal shield designed to protect my life's work. When the old leadership eventually stepped down and Julian's family aggressively took over the board, the new management team was simply too lazy and too arrogant to conduct a thorough legal audit of the historical vendor contracts. They saw a brilliant tool running flawlessly on their internal servers and ignorantly assumed it was a native, in-house asset. Julian truly believes that the non-disclosure agreement guarantees him full operational control, I told Elias, staring out the window at the sprawling city skyline. "Of course he does," Elias replied, his tone smooth, dark, and deadly. "He just blindly signed a document that legally validates his willful theft of a highly classified third-party commercial asset. Now, we just sit back and wait for him to try and monetize stolen property." We began our silent countdown right then and there. Julian was a weak man driven by an insatiable ego and a desperate, burning need to prove his worth to his powerful family. We knew with absolute certainty that he would not just quietly sit on the software. He would try to sell it. He would try to parade it around to wealthy investors to secure his legacy. All Elias and I had to do was sit in the absolute quiet of the massive legal trap we had meticulously constructed and wait for him to put his catastrophic, career-ending mistake in writing. The sheer, invisible weight of his impending downfall was suffocating, and as I finished my glass of wine, I had never felt more completely at peace. The absence of a foundational architect is rarely felt like a sudden explosion. It is much more like a slow, toxic leak in a pressurized cabin. Within days of my departure, the Oragrid data pipelines began to stutter. Minor processing delays crept into the daily reporting cycles. A handful of complex queries that used to execute in milliseconds suddenly dragged on for agonizing minutes, quietly choking the server memory. To a seasoned engineer, these were glaring red sirens screaming that the core logic was beginning to drift without its master control protocols. But Julian did not possess the eyes of an engineer. He only had the eyes of a starving wolf staring at a massive pile of fresh meat. Julian completely ignored the escalating back-end latency reports crossing his desk. He was entirely consumed by a monumental prize hovering just out of his reach. He was aggressively preparing to weaponize the algorithm to pitch a massive, exclusive enterprise contract with a legendary financial conglomerate based on Wall Street. The deal was absolutely staggering. It was valued at exactly $50 million. Securing a partnership of that magnitude would not just solidify his position as a corporate savior, it would catapult him onto the cover of major financial magazines. He was blinded by the glowing promise of his own impending fame. However, the seasoned risk management executives working at the Wall Street firm were not fools. Before they committed $50 million to a new technological infrastructure, their aggressive legal team demanded absolute, ironclad proof that AuraGrid possessed unencumbered, exclusive rights to the underlying data processing engine. They needed a guarantee that no rogue developer could suddenly appear and claim royalties or file a crippling injunction. This was the precise moment Julian's monumental arrogance completely short-circuited whatever tiny amount of common sense he possessed. In his frantic desperation to close the deal and prove his total dominance over the technology, he drafted an email to the lead Wall Street partners. My phone vibrated violently against the smooth marble of my kitchen island on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was peacefully brewing a pot of loose-leaf jasmine tea, watching the steam curl elegantly toward the ceiling. I picked up the device and saw a massive encrypted file dump from the same loyal former colleague who had messaged me during the virtual meeting. He was utterly disgusted by what he was witnessing inside the company network and had decided to secretly become my digital inside man. He had managed to capture high-resolution screenshots of Julian's outgoing external communications. I opened the first image and felt a cold, sharp thrill radiate through my chest. Julian had actually done it. To appease the Wall Street lawyers, Julian had attached a scanned document copy of the exact draconian non-disclosure agreement he had forced me to sign, but it was the body of his email that truly sealed his fate. Julian had boldly typed, "Please find attached the formalized severance and intellectual property forfeiture of our former lead architect. The weak predecessor has fully surrendered all source code and proprietary architecture. AuraGrid Analytics legally holds 100% copyright and uncontested operational ownership of the entire system." He did not stop there. High off his perceived victory, Julian immediately took his victory lap to the public square of the modern corporate world. He published a long, incredibly boastful post on his professional networking profile. He heavily implied that certain employees suffered from severe delusions of grandeur and fundamentally failed to understand that true innovation required bold, visionary leadership. He literally referred to the newly integrated system as his own personal masterpiece, claiming he had single-handedly streamlined the architecture by cutting out the stagnant dead wood. I stood in my quiet, sunlit kitchen, calmly sipping my hot tea while staring at the glowing screen. The absolute silence of my apartment stood in beautiful, stark contrast to the chaotic, high-stakes gamble happening a few miles away. Julian thought he was sealing the ultimate victory. He had absolutely no idea that he had just committed commercial suicide. By officially using that specific legal document to secure a $50 million commercial transaction, and by explicitly claiming the software as internal company property to third-party investors, he had crossed a terrifying legal threshold. He was no longer just an arrogant boss firing an employee. He was now actively committing severe commercial fraud. He was engaging in the willful, documented theft and unauthorized distribution of an independent commercial asset. The very document he thought protected him had just transformed into a glowing, radioactive confession of federal intellectual property violations. He had picked up the loaded gun I left on my desk, pointed it directly at his own forehead, and gleefully pulled the trigger. I immediately forwarded the entire encrypted dossier to Elias. I did not even need to type a single word of explanation. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone rang. "I have the screenshots, the email headers, and the precise timestamps," Elias said, his voice dropping into a register so dark and smooth it sounded like a finely tailored threat. He actually used the exit agreement to market the stolen asset across state lines. It is almost too beautiful to believe. I am formally locking down the digital forensic trail as we speak. "Is it enough?" I asked. setting my teacup down on the counter. "It is a legal slaughter," Elias replied coldly. "The arrow has officially left the bow. It is time to let it strike." When amateur corporate lawyers want to intimidate a rival organization, they send a polite warning email. They make an angry, blustering phone call. They draft a standard cease and desist letter demanding a sit-down negotiation. Elias was not an amateur. He was an apex predator who operated strictly in the shadows until it was time to strike. We did not send a warning. We did not ask for a meeting. We executed a flawless, unannounced tactical strike directly at the central nervous system of Aura Grid Analytics. On a perfectly ordinary Thursday morning, exactly at 10 o'clock, a bonded courier wearing a severe black uniform bypassed the standard mailroom and took the executive elevator straight to the top floor. He carried a heavy, heavily sealed, oversized package. He completely ignored the junior assistants and required a direct physical signature from the general counsel of AuraGrid. The general counsel was a seasoned corporate veteran named Richard, a man who spent his days comfortably protecting the company from routine employee disputes and minor liability claims. He had absolutely no idea he was about to open a box containing the total, catastrophic destruction of his company. Inside that thick envelope was a devastatingly precise legal dossier compiled by Elias. It was not a request for communication. It was a unilateral declaration of war. The opening document was a blindingly clear cease and desist mandate, but it was the supporting exhibits that formed a completely inescapable, ironclad cage of liability. The legal terminology was incredibly sharp, heavily academic, yet brutally easy to understand. Exhibit A was the pristine Federal Copyright Registration Certificate for the foundational architecture of the algorithm. It clearly established that the entire codebase was the exclusive intellectual property of my independent, privately held limited liability company. It proved unequivocally that the code never belonged to me as an individual employee, and it certainly never belonged to AuraGrid. Exhibit B was the original, highly confidential software licensing agreement. This was the brilliant, quiet contract I had signed with the former chief executive officer 3 years ago. The document explicitly detailed that AuraGrid was merely leasing the operational rights to my algorithm on a strict, month-to-month basis. But the true stroke of genius, the absolute fatal blow, was the termination clause. The lease was contractually bound to my physical employment. The exact second Julian pushed that cheap cardboard box across the conference room table and officially terminated my position, that licensing agreement instantly dissolved. AuraGrid's legal right to use the software vanished into thin air on that Friday afternoon. Exhibit C contained the damning digital forensics. It was a pristine stack of the intercepted communications, the arrogant professional networking posts, and the explicit email Julian had sent to the massive Wall Street financial firm. It was irrefutable. Hard evidence that a high-ranking company executive was actively attempting to sell and distribute a stolen commercial asset across state lines to secure a $50 million partnership. But the absolute masterpiece of the entire dossier, the explosive twist that elevated this from a simple breach of contract to a catastrophic, criminal-level offense, was Exhibit D. Exhibit D was the exact non-disclosure agreement Julian had forced me to sign. Elias had taken Julian's ultimate weapon and turned it into the very blade that would slice the throat of the company. During our termination meeting, Julian had smugly inserted a draconian clause explicitly stating that AuraGrid assumed total ownership of all intellectual property, data, and assets left behind in the building. He thought he was being a ruthless corporate shark stripping a weak employee of her rights, but legally, because I did not personally own the software, Julian had unknowingly drafted a formal confession by legally claiming ownership of the servers and the external drives I left on my desk. The non-disclosure agreement ceased to be a confidentiality contract. It transformed into a legally binding, signed admission of unauthorized asset misappropriation. Julian had put his own signature on a document explicitly confirming that his company had willfully confiscated and stolen the property of an independent third-party corporation. We did not demand my old job back. We did not ask for a few months of severance pay. We demanded blood. The formal notice demanded an immediate payment of $15 million in statutory and punitive damages for willful copyright infringement and commercial fraud. However, the $15 million was merely a distraction. The true weapon was the final document in the stack, a notice of an emergency preliminary injunction filed in federal court. This was not a request for money. It was a legal kill switch. The injunction legally mandated that Oragrid must immediately and completely cease all use of the algorithm. They had to power down the specific servers running the stolen code, isolate the databases, and halt all operations utilizing my proprietary logic. I can only imagine the absolute horror that washed over Richard, the general counsel, as he sat in his luxurious corner office and read through those pages. The color must have completely drained from his face. His hands must have trembled violently as he realized the sheer magnitude of the nightmare unfolding on his mahogany desk. He was a smart enough lawyer to recognize a flawless legal trap when he saw one. He understood instantly that Julian had not simply fired a competent engineer to massage his own fragile ego. Julian had unknowingly planted a massive, unexploded bomb directly inside their primary data center. And then he had gleefully lit the fuse just days before the company was scheduled to sign the biggest, most lucrative contract of the decade. The legal logic was absolute. It was completely irrefutable. Oragrid was caught holding stolen merchandise. They had documented their own theft in writing, and they were currently trying to fence that stolen merchandise to a Wall Street giant. Richard knew that if he ignored the federal injunction, the government could literally seize their servers. He also knew that the Wall Street lawyers would instantly abandon the $50 million deal the second they caught a single whiff of federal litigation. The silence that followed the delivery of that package was not the silence of peace. It was the terrifying, breathless vacuum that occurs in the exact fraction of a second right before a skyscraper completely collapses in on itself. The corporate world operates entirely on a fragile facade of ultimate control. But nothing shatters that illusion faster than the sudden, suffocating threat of total financial ruin. I was not physically present in the heavily guarded Oragrid executive suite at 2 o'clock in the morning on that fateful Friday, but between the frantic, minute-by-minute text messages from my loyal inside source and the meticulously detailed timeline Elias later forced out of them during the discovery phase, I could visualize the sheer, unadulterated panic as clearly as if I were sitting directly at the head of their polished oak table. The emergency board meeting was a masterclass in absolute, unrestrained chaos. Sterling Vance, the supposedly untouchable chief executive officer, had been dragged violently from his luxurious bed in the wealthy suburbs. He arrived at the glass tower looking entirely disheveled, his face flushed with a furious, terrified crimson. He was immediately surrounded by vicious board members who had been summoned under the terrifying threat of impending federal indictments and catastrophic financial collapse. The central air conditioning was running at full blast, chilling the room to the bone, yet the air reeked of stale coffee, sour sweat, and sudden desperation. The executives were hyperventilating, pacing the floor, and furiously demanding answers that simply did not exist. They summoned Julian from his downtown loft. He walked into that freezing conference room roughly 20 minutes later, completely oblivious to the massacre awaiting him, true to his utterly unbearable nature. He was still wearing a casual designer t-shirt under a sharp, custom-tailored blazer, even in the middle of the night. He confidently took a seat, crossed his legs, and flashed that same condescending, highly practiced smile he had given me just days prior. When Sterling slammed his fist on the table and demanded an explanation for the massive federal injunction sitting in front of them, Julian actually laughed out loud. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, attempting to completely minimize the catastrophic situation with his usual brand of arrogant charm. "This is nothing but a pathetic, desperate bluff," Julian declared to the room, his voice dripping with unearned confidence. "Morgan is just a bitter, disgruntled former employee throwing a predictable tantrum because she could not adapt to our new lean vision. She is simply trying to extort us for a slightly larger severance check. Richard, please tell them to calm down. Our legal department can easily crush this woman by breakfast. We will countersue her into oblivion." "Richard, the general counsel, did not nod in agreement. He did not offer a reassuring smile or back up the arrogant vice president. Instead, he looked at Julian with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute, unfiltered horror. Richard slowly stood up, his hands shaking with rage. He grabbed the heavy stack of original lease agreements and the federal copyright certificates that Elias had delivered, and he violently hurled them across the length of the glass table. The heavy papers slammed directly into Julian's chest, scattering wildly across his lap and onto the floor. "Read the damn documents, you absolute fool!" Richard practically screamed, completely losing every single ounce of his usually composed professional demeanor. The veins in his neck were bulging. "We do not own the algorithm. We never owned it. The core technology you just confidently pitched to the biggest financial institution on Wall Street belongs entirely to an independent, third-party corporation. And thanks to that incredibly stupid exit agreement you personally drafted and forced her to sign to inflate your own ego, you legally confessed, in writing, that we seized her property without authorization. You did not just fire an engineer. Julian, you committed federal corporate espionage and massive commercial fraud, and you put my name on the building you are currently burning to the ground." Julian's smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sickly, pale expression. He stared down at the documents in his lap, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text as the horrifying reality of his own monumental stupidity finally began to set in. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, to spin another web of meaningless corporate buzzwords about synergy and pivoting, but before a single word could escape his lips, the heavy black conference phone sitting in the dead center of the table began to ring. The shrill, piercing sound cut through the tense silence of the room like an air raid siren. It was the lead compliance partner from the Wall Street firm, Elias, operating with the cold, surgical precision of a true legal assassin, had not just sent the explosive dossier to Oragrid, he had carefully orchestrated a totally anonymous, highly secure leak of the intellectual property dispute directly to the risk management division of the Wall Street firm. Financial giants do not play games with contested technological assets. The voice emanating from the speakerphone was ice cold and purely transactional. They bluntly informed Sterling Vance that they had just been made aware of a massive, undisclosed legal liability regarding the exact proprietary technology they were about to purchase, effective immediately. The entire $50 million exclusive contract negotiation was completely frozen indefinitely. They would be launching their own independent investigation. The call disconnected with a sharp, unforgiving click, leaving a ringing, deafening silence in its wake. The room instantly erupted into a war zone. The sudden loss of a $50 million contract was not a mere setback. It was a catastrophic financial failure that would guarantee the company's stock plunged directly into the abyss by the time the markets opened. Sterling Vance turned his head slowly to look at his nephew. The blind nepotism that had protected and shielded Julian his entire life completely evaporated in the face of absolute financial ruin. Sterling finally saw Julian for exactly what he was: an incompetent, arrogant liability who had just single-handedly destroyed the future of the entire enterprise. The rest of the board of directors did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. They aggressively turned their collective fury directly onto Sterling. They began screaming over one another, demanding immediate accountability, and explicitly threatening to officially oust Sterling from his position as chief executive officer by sunrise if he did not resolve this catastrophe instantly and flawlessly. Julian physically collapsed inward. The stylish, expensive blazer suddenly looked 3 sizes too big for his shrinking, pathetic frame. He stammered, stuttered, and desperately tried to shift the blame, pointing trembling fingers at the legal department, the engineering team, and even his own uncle. He whined that he was just trying to optimize the workflow, but no one was listening. Not a single person in that heavily air-conditioned room cared about his motivational podcast quotes, his visionary mindset, or his flashy, hollow facade anymore. The illusion was completely dead. As the shouting intensified and the crushing reality of federal injunctions and frozen millions sucked the oxygen out of the room, a terrifying, inescapable truth settled over the wealthy board of directors. The absolute survival of AuraGrid Analytics, their massive personal wealth, and their entire professional futures were no longer in their own hands. They were entirely, hopelessly at the mercy of the quiet, practical woman they had just callously thrown out onto the street with nothing but a cheap cardboard box. The formal settlement negotiations did not take place in the cold of frosted glass rooms of AuraGrid Analytics. Elias insisted on a completely neutral, highly controlled environment. We secured a massive, sunlit boardroom on the 40th floor of a prestigious downtown law firm. I arrived precisely on time. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. When I walked through the heavy mahogany double doors, the contrast was immediately striking. Across the expansive polished table sat the entire executive board of AuraGrid Analytics. They looked like they had aged an entire decade over the course of a single weekend. Sterling Vance was visibly sweating. His usually immaculate posture collapsed. Richard, the general counsel, looked physically ill, and might just as Elias had demanded as a non-negotiable prerequisite for this meeting. Julian was entirely absent. He was explicitly banned from the premises. Sterling Vance cleared his throat, attempting to salvage whatever tiny fragment of authority he still possessed. He practically begged. He offered an astronomical sum to purchase the algorithm outright, desperately trying to acquire total ownership to immediately revive the frozen $50 million Wall Street contract. He used desperate words like partnership, reconciliation, and moving forward together. I sat in complete silence and let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then, I looked at Elias, who smoothly opened a sleek leather binder and slid a single, crisp document across the table. "We are not selling the intellectual property," I said, my voice calm, steady, and utterly devoid of sympathy. "The foundational architecture remains my exclusive property forever. However, because I am a pragmatic businesswoman, I am willing to authorize a new operational lease agreement. The monthly licensing fee will be exactly 10 times my former annual salary. Furthermore, to resolve the documented federal copyright infringement and the severe breach of contract initiated by your organization, AuraGrid will pay an immediate penalty settlement of precisely $5 million. That amount is non-negotiable and payable within 24 hours. The board members gasped, whispering frantically among themselves. The financial penalty was staggering, but they knew it was still vastly cheaper than a total corporate collapse. But I was not finished. "There is one final, non-negotiable condition before I sign anything," I stated, leaning slightly forward. "The financial terms are merely the foundation. The true cost of doing business with me requires an immediate change in your executive structure. Julian is to be terminated from this company. Effective this exact second. He will receive absolutely zero severance pay. You will formally strip him of every single share of corporate equity he currently holds. Finally, by 5 o'clock this afternoon, Human Resources will distribute a transparent company-wide email to every single employee. This email will explicitly retract the previous defamatory statements made about my departure, and it will formally admit that executive management made a catastrophic error regarding the ownership of the software." The silence in the room was absolute. Sterling Vance looked absolutely destroyed. He stared at me, searching my eyes for any hint of flexibility or mercy. He found absolutely none. The board of directors turned their collective gaze toward him, their expressions hardening into stone. They silently communicated a single, brutal truth. It was either his nephew, or it was the entire company. Sterling's hands trembled violently as he picked up his heavy gold pen. He pulled the termination documents toward himself. Right there, under the bright fluorescent lights of the neutral boardroom, the chief executive officer signed the official documents, effectively destroying his own nephew's career and financial future, entirely at my command. I signed the licensing agreement, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked out of the building. As the elevator descended to the ground floor, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a long, incredibly desperate, and deeply bitter text message from an unregistered phone number. It was a frantic combination of pathetic apologies and vicious insults, unmistakably typed by a broken, humiliated Julian. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the need to reply. I simply smiled, pressed the button to permanently block the number, and stepped out into the warm, golden afternoon air. 30 minutes later, I was driving my car down a sprawling Texas highway. The sky was burning with a brilliant, vibrant sunset, painting the horizon in deep shades of orange and purple. A steady, rhythmic indie rock song played softly through the car speakers, matching the peaceful beating of my own heart. The cool evening breeze flowed freely through the open windows. For months, people like Julian had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They fundamentally misunderstood the game. My silence was never about passive endurance. It was always a meticulously crafted, perfectly hidden bear trap. And the most satisfying part was that I never even had to push them. Those who obsessively play reckless games of corporate power will always, inevitably, step right into the jaws of the trap all by themselves. Hello, everyone, and thank you so genuinely for tuning in and listening to my story today. Where in the world are you listening from? Please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's journey of corporate justice satisfying, please consider helping us keep this community alive. You can support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to our absolute best, highly detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code directly on your screen, or by clicking the link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay strong out there.